So we're on Daf Ayin Vav Amid Aleph, and hopefully it'll be clear enough from my office. I think it's going to be you and me today. And we are, so I don't have the same Daf, but I think we are, well, I don't actually know where we are, but let's start from the near the top. I'm Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel. It's probably the second line or the third line.
Yeah, I got it.
So we read this yesterday, but we can read it again. So or maybe we didn't read it yesterday. So anyways, we talked yesterday about the question of a puncture, right? So let's say there's a hole or a wound in the penis where, either pus or semen is coming out of. So it says Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Nikav v'nistam. If you get a hole and it gets sealed up. Now remember, this obviously reminds us a lot of what we talk about with the treifa, right? Because with the treifa, one of the big issues is that if there's a hole in the lungs or a hole in other organs, it's a treifa, but if it gets sealed over, it might not be, right? So similar concept here. It says Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel is if it's nikav v'nistam, so it depends on function. Kol she'ilo nikrei v'nikra. If the person nikrei means they have carry, they have semen, they discharge, and well, not discharge, but semen, ejaculate, and nikra, and the hole tears again, meaning that it's not really healed, then pasul. Then they're considered to be pasul because they can't ejaculate normally, and that's considered to be a krot shufcha. But ilav, if not, meaning as long as it's healed and they can ejaculate normally, then kasher. Havi barav. Now Rava wondered when Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel said this halacha, hey, where exactly is this hole in the penis? If it's below, remember below here means further away from the body, so away from the towards the tip, from the atara. Why do we care if there's a hole? We said yesterday, even if it was cut off, but even if there was a hole, the whole area was removed, it would be kosher. So what if there's a hole? It's not worse than removing it completely. Ella, what it means is ba'atara atzma. It means in the ridge of the atara itself, if there's a puncture, then it depends. If it's a puncture and it heals up, then everything's okay. And if it doesn't heal up, and the way you test it is when the person ejaculates, whether the hole opens up again. Itmar Nami, in fact, we have another saying just like to support this. Amar of Mari, Bar Mar, Amar Mar Ukfa, Amar Shmuel, that Nikav Batara Atzma, if there's a hole in the actual Atara, crown is the English of Atara, but that ridge level of the penis itself, then b'nistam, and it gets closed up. Kol she'ilo nikrei v'nikra pasul. If the time that the person ejaculates, it rips open and it comes out of that hole, or that hole is damaged, then it's pasul. Ilav, but if not, it's kasher. Shalach be Rava brei Rava reveals. So Rava, the son of Rava, asked Yosef the following question, which again turns out to be a very important question when you think about this halacha l'maisa. Because the question was, this person had a wound, right? And they had an injury. It healed over. And the test is, if the person ejaculates, will it rip open again? The question is, how do you test it? How do we test this? What do we do? Right? How in the world would you know without actually doing it, without actually observing it?
Right, exactly.
Sorry?
I was thinking the same thing.
So Amarle, so he said to them, well, you have to test it. How do you test it? So the strategy they have for encouraging or forcing someone to ejaculate was the following. It would be Maitinan Nahama, right? You would bring some bread that was warm. Nahama, Chamima means warm, Disari of barley. And I don't know why exactly, but that somehow stimulates the nerves or stimulates erection. Omanchinale abe pukri, you put it at his pukri usually means the anus, right, where things come out of. So you put it somewhere below, I guess, like the testicles, where very sensitive. Umikre, and that will cause him to ejaculate. And then you see the chazinale. So you have you do it like in the doctor's office. And this is the way they stimulated someone to ejaculate. They would bring a warm piece of bread and put it on that area. Amar Abaya, says Abaya, really? That's what you have to do. Atu kuli alma Yaakov Avinu have. Is everybody like Yaakov Avinu? Yaakov Avinu very famously never ejaculated when he wasn't supposed to. Because he said in his brachot at the end of his life about Ruvain, Kochi Roshit Oni. You are my strength and the beginning of my power, implying that you are when Ruvain was born, it was the first time Yaakov had ever seen ejaculated in his life. Carry me up. So you're implying like this, everyone is really hard for us to get them to ejaculate. You've got to do this procedure where you bring this warm bread and put it there. Ella says Abaya, it's not really that hard. Maviran kame big day tivon, and you just have to turn them on. You just bring in front of him clothes that are colorful, which obviously in those days I guess was a very big taboo, right? So that's erotic enough that you will cause a regular person, to ejaculate, and then you'll find out. You don't have to. It doesn't take that much. Show him some pictures, but it doesn't mean pictures. It means clothing that's colorful. Again, obviously from the Gemara's context, we know they had tremendous separation of sexes. We had tremendous conservatism, as we might say, in clothing. And so this would be enough to cause a person to ejaculate. Amar Rava, said Rava, well, that's going a little too far. Atu kuli alma barzilai hagiladihu. I think everyone is like Barzilai Giladi. Rashi quotes here the Gemara talks about how Barzilai was thought, the Gemara says he was shatuf bizima. He was stewed in sexuality, and he would just was sleeping with everybody. But he's a person who, is the other extreme with Yaakov, someone who's ejaculating all the time. That's, not every person is going to have ejaculate just from seeing Bigdei Tzivonim. Ela macharate kedushanina meikara. You go back to what we learned originally, which is that you have to stimulate the person to have an ejaculate, and you test it. But basically, you test it. Obviously, the poskim today quote that we really don't know how to do this, and that it's not exactly, something that you would do at home or even in any Beit Din. But that's officially the way you're supposed to test.
Well, I mean, my son did, before they did chemotherapy, he went to a semen bank or whatever,
Right.
sperm bank, right?
Right.
I'm sure they have their ways of doing that.
Yeah. So they have their ways. I mean, obviously, there's ways. The question really was for a Beit Din, I guess. Is how do you do it? I mean,
Right.
now,
This wasn't observed, right? I think
Right.
it's right.
Correct.
Yeah.
But from a Beit Din standpoint, if you really need this, or medical, you can choose medical. It sounds a little better. Good morning, James. You're here just in time for the next thing.
You just missed it. Maybe we should go do some.
No, don't worry. We'll have more of it. We're gonna get to a really good story. Just wait for a second. So a real medical story. So we're up to Tanur Abanan. I'm at work and I don't exactly have a Gemara, so I don't exactly know how many lines down we are.
We're about a third of the way down.
Okay, Tanur Abanan. Nikav pasul. If a person has a hole in their penis, they are pasul, meaning that they are a krot shifra, and therefore they cannot marry into Bnei Yisrael. Mipnei shehu shotet. The reason for that is because if there's a hole, then the semen doesn't come out the right way. I used the word dribble yesterday, but it just drops out. So it doesn't go out, like Rashi says, like a chitz, like an arrow. It doesn't shoot out. And if semen doesn't shoot out, it's not capable of making a woman pregnant. That's what we learned earlier, went to Shmuel. So that's why it's pasul. But nistam, if you seal up the hole, then you're kosher, right? Because now everything's okay. Mipnei shehu molid. Because now you can have a child. Again, another saying in the Gemara where it seems to very clearly imply this whole issue of krot shofcha has to do with fertility, right? And as long as fertility is preserved, everything is okay. So mipnei shehu molid. Zehu pesul shechozer lehechshero. This is an example of the person or a situation in which it's pasul, but it can turn back to be kosher. Now, zehu is always to exclude something, right? This is a case, but it doesn't happen all the time. Zehu limute mai says, as I said earlier, it's the mute krum shala machmat maka b're'ah. It's to exclude a membrane. A krum is a layer, right? We call it a sircha, right? A layer that grows in the lung, re'ah is the lung, because of a wound. The anokrum, that doesn't count. Remember, this was a whole big question in treifa, that if an animal gets a puncture in their lung, they're pasul, they're a treifa. If it heals, they're still a treifa. And the question the Gemara discussed, and we discussed this very practical halacha, is that after an animal dies, they check the lung for what are called sirchot, right? These little bubbles kind of things. And one of the assumptions, which we don't really go with, is that every time you see a bubble, you have to assume there's a hole under that, and therefore it's treifa, right? The Ashkenazim are pretty makel. We take off the bubbles, we check, etc. But that's a different example. So unlike this case of krot shofcha, which is not a treifa, right? It's just a function. If it doesn't work, he's a krot shofcha. If it seals up and it works, he's kosher. Okay, so you can go back to your original state. Now, Shalach le Rav Idi bar Avin Abaye. This is a fascinating and wonderful Gemara. Rav Idi bar Avin asked Abaya, Hecha Avdina. So tell me from a doctor's standpoint, from a surgical standpoint, you have a man who got a wound in his penis. He has a hole. If that heals, he's going to be kosher. How do you encourage that to heal? What's the best way to treat puncture wounds in the penis? Okay. And I think the general question is, how do you perform microsurgery, right, or surgery maybe, at a time when they didn't have the tools for surgery? So they have a brilliant strategy. I can't tell you whether it works or not. Maitinan sa'arta, what you should do is take a piece of barley. So barley is a very tiny grain. It has sharp edges. Again, I don't know that much about barley, but I guess, it has sharp edges. And what you do is you use it basically as a scalpel. The
Oh,
misartinum, you basically scrape around the area where the hole is. So you clean off the edge, but you also irritate it. So that's going to start healing together. And then what you do is maitinan tarba. You bring some fat, tarba is fat, vishafinan, and you smear it on there. I'm not sure where the fat's from, but you bring some, good fat. I don't exactly know what that does, if that irritates it or that gives it the nutrients it needs to heal. And then this is the best part. Maitinan shumshima gamma. You bring a large ant. Okay, shumshima is an ant, right? Gamma means large. So you bring a large ant, uminatkinale, and you let it bite. So you hold the ant up to this wound in the penis, and you let the ant bite the flesh, and then once the ant bites it, you cut off the head of the ant. Okay, got it? Uminatkinale. It bites it. Paskinale the ration. You cut off its head. And so what happens, presumably, is that the ant is dead, but the head of the ant, or at least the bite of the ant, is still in the person, and it will dissolve over time. But basically, the action of the ant is essentially like a suture, right? It pulls it back, it pulls it together. Because the ant is biting on both sides, and it causes the skin to come together in a very small way. Ants have very small teeth, so in a much, much finer way than you can ever do by hand or do in any other way. So you rely on the ant. You have to kill the ant, otherwise the ant will keep biting, I guess. But you kill the ant and you leave it there. And dafka sa'arta, you have to use a barley seed for this to irritate it. Avo parzla, if you use a scalpel, like I said, if you use metal, parzla means metal or iron, then mizraf zaref, it will inflame the area and it will not heal properly. So that's the way you do this, is basically you irritate the area, you put, I don't know what the oil does exactly, but you put some fat on top of it, and then you have to get an animal, a small, very small, well, it's a big ant, but a small mouth, to sort of clamp it shut, and then it will heal. I'm not sure how long it takes, but that was how they did surgery.
so if the person is in this condition, he doesn't have to get divorced right away. They can try to fix it. I mean,
Correct.
what's the timing? You know what I mean?
Right, correct. So it's true. It's not defined. Obviously, if they're working on it, he can't sleep with his wife during this time.
Right.
But as long as they're working on it, I don't think he has to get divorced. I don't have a specific time.
Right.
But yeah, and obviously today this is a whole different, I mean, they just do the surgical, right? You can do this, but the point is you don't need the ants, right? That's just what
No,
technology that they had.
No, I know. I'm just saying that, like, you have this condition,
Right.
you can't.
You can, but as long as you're working on it, right? I mean, we don't consider it. You're not living together with a plan to have sleep inappropriately. So,
Okay.
so that's the strategy. Now says the Gemara, but
The fat is to encourage the ant to bite. The fat is the ant food.
Okay, that sounds like a good explanation. Bahani mili katan. Now this is only works. There's two different pshatim here. Rashi's pshat, I think, is only if it's a small hole. Avad gadol, but if it's a large one, ikapoli mikpal, it will peel away, meaning it will open up. So whatever surface you cover it, if the area is too large, this is not going to be a sufficient strategy. Now, there's another pshat that's referring to hanmila katan, is that it refers to a young person, but an older person doesn't heal as well, and so it won't work as well. Okay, anyways, that's how they did it. Continues the Gemara, the next detail of this. Amarabba barafuna hamatil mayim mishnei mikomot. The person who goes and urinates from two different places. Remember, we said yesterday that they had a belief that there were a stream for urine and a stream for semen. So a person who passes urine through two different places and there are two different holes or two different outputs in the penis is pasul. Amarava, that's wrong. Let hilchata lo kibra. Halacha is not like the son, which is Rabba barafuna, and lo ka'aba, it's not like his father Rafuna in a different case. Bra hadamar, the son is the case we just said, where he said if you have two places where you urinate, you're not kosher. Abba is a very interesting halacha, which is really not so relevant, but somehow like Gemara thinks is relevant. Damar Rafuna said a detail, Rabba's father, right? Rabba Rafuna's father, that nashim hamisolalot zu bezu, two women who literally misolot means rub, they rub against each other, they have, lesbian intercourse, psula lekuhuna, they would be pasul lekuhuna, Rav Huna says, because just like with a man or a woman who slept together inappropriately makes her a zona, makes him problem too, but makes her a zona, then she's pasul lekuhuna. The same thing says Rav Huna is true about two women sleeping together inappropriate, or which is always in Torah inappropriate. So she's pasul lekuhuna. Says Rava, that's wrong. That's not the halacha. We don't pass in that way. And continues Rava, or maybe it's the Gemara, I feel Rebbe Lazar, even according to Rebbe Lazar, who we don't pass like we quoted earlier a few times, that a unmarried man and unmarried woman who are not prohibited from the Torah from sleeping together, shalol l'shem ishut, to sleep together not for the purpose of getting married, but just to have intercourse, that is asa zona. That makes her zona when possible for a kohen. We don't pass in that way. But even according to Rebbe Lazar, hani mili ish, that's only true by a man who has intercourse in what the Torah considers a regular way. Aval isha, but a woman, it's pritzuta ba'alma, it's just an inappropriate act, but there's nothing that's sex about, there's nothing intercourse about that, and therefore it does not make her a zona and does not passel her likuhuna, even according to that opinion. So we don't pass again, that is passel either. Continues the Mishnah. What a good segue. Continues the Mishnah, Petzua Daka. Remember, we read yesterday the pasuk which says, Lo yavo Petzua Daka u'krot shevcha b'kahal Hashem. You can't marry into the kahal. It says our Mishnah, the kahal means...
So a lesbian can marry a Kohen.
According to this Gemara, yeah. That's totally possible. Tosfos has more detail about this, that maybe it's not referring to just rubbing, it's referring to actually where she takes semen that I guess he ejaculated into her and puts into another woman. So it's a little bit of a different issue. Tosfos discusses this if you want to look more. But yes, the answer is she can marry. It says the Mishnah, Petzua Daka Krot Shavcha, the Tosfos says, Lo Yavo B'Kal Hashem, they can marry a Gioret Mishuchra. So it says Kahal Hashem, does not include, which is a disturbing Gemara, but it's the Mishnah, I think it's maybe Paskin. It does not include a convert. Convert, and again, this is probably first generation, right? So the person who converted themselves is not called Kahal Hashem, and they can marry a person who is a Krut Shevcha or a Petzua Daka. Because they're only prohibited to marry into the Kahal, into the congregation of Hashem, or congregation, Kal Hashem. That's our mission. Now, so saying that a Petzua Daka is allowed to sleep with a Gior, because they can marry B'Kal Hashem, but they can marry into a convert, or to a convert. Ask the Gemara, now they asked Rav Sheshet, what about a Petzua Daka Kohen La? What if he's a Kohen and he becomes a Petzua Daka, right? So he's no longer allowed to marry a B'Kal Hashem. He can't marry any woman who's Kal Hashem. The question is, can he marry a Gior to Mishucheret, right? Because we said earlier, and there's a machloket, but this is, I think, how we pass it. I'm pretty sure. Certainly the way the Gemara seems to go, is that a Kohen cannot marry a Gior to Mishucheret. A Kohen cannot marry a woman herself who converted, because we call her a Zona because she presumably had sex when she was not Jewish. Okay, we discussed before she was less than 3, right? We had all these discussions. So a Kohen himself cannot marry Gior to Mishucheret. But what if he's a Petzua Daka? So is he now not a Kohen anymore? B'kedushatei kai, is he still called a Kedusha v'Kohen v'Asir? Or do you say that he's not a Kohen for this purpose? Now, again, this is very complicated because there's many roles of a Kohen, and it implied from the previous Mishnah that he can eat Truma. Remember, he can feed his Eved Truma, and he can eat Truma. It's a Petzua Daka. So he clearly doesn't lose all status of Kuhuna. But the question is, in terms of relationships, sort of Yisurei Biyah, does he lose his status of Kohen? So I'm a layer of Sheshet Tnitua. Well, I think it's pretty obvious from our Mishnah. What does our Mishnah say? I'm sorry, not our Mishnah, from a Braita. The Braita says, Petzua Daka Yisrael. A Petzua Daka who's Yisrael. Do you all have Girsa Yisrael in your Gemara? I think it's machloket about the Girsa. Does your Gemara say Petzua Daka Yisrael?
Kohen.
It says the word Petzua Daka Kohen?
Yeah? No?
That's a mistake.
Where's the second line of the Gemara?
No, the next one. Amar le Rav Sheshet. Rav Sheshet said Tinitua.
Petzua Daka Yisrael, yeah.
Yisrael. Okay, so that's the gear. So a Petzua Daka of Yisrael, Mutar v'Nitina, is allowed to marry Nitina. Remember, the Nitinim were a group of people who came. So remember, there's halakha in the Torah that says that you're not allowed to marry the Shiva Amanim. The 7 nations who were in Eretz Yisrael, when Eretz Canaan, when Bnei Yisrael went in, You can't marry them. Presume we're going to discuss now what that means. You can't marry them, but there's a prohibition of them more than every other nation. So remember, the Netinim were people who were not Netinim. They were where were they from? They were from somewhere. I think Givonim, right? The Netinim were people. I forgot where they came from. The Netinim were one of the tribes, one of the 7 Amimim, and the Netinim came basically, and the Givonim, and they dressed up. Remember the whole story in Yeshua? They dressed up as if they had traveled far away, and they said to Yeshua, "We come from really far away. We're from Saudi Arabia, and so we want to be Megayer." And Yeshua accepted them as converts. Right. And then it turned out that they were lying, and were living next door, and they just had dressed up as if they had come from very far away. And really, they would have never accepted them had they known. So Yeshua felt he couldn't back down. He already had promised that he would protect them and accept them, but he cursed them, or he punished them, and he made them the Shoavei Mayim. They got the lowest job, like the water carriers. So now the Givonim, or what are called the Netinim, because he made them, Netinim, he placed them, he made them the Shoavei Mayim. So they are prohibited, they are mutar, says the Braita, to marry a Petzua Daka, even though they're not really allowed to marry into Yisrael. Ask the Gemara, what do you mean? If you say that a person who's a Petzua Daka stays in their status, in this case of a Yisrael, it says don't sleep with them, right? Don't marry them. It's referring to all the Shiva Amimim, and then Netina comes from the Shiva Amimim. Even though they tricked Yoshua, they're still from the Shiva Amimim. Amar Rava, says Rava, has nothing to do with that. The reason a Yisrael is not allowed to marry a Netin is not because he's Kodesh and they're not Kodesh, right? That's true about a Kohen. It's not true about a Yisrael. Is there, it's not because of your Kodesh or not Kodesh. It's because we don't want a Ben Yisrael to marry a woman from the Shiva Amamim because they're shatuf, they are steeped in idol worship. And we're worried, Dilma Molid Ben, Vazal Palachla, Vadozara. If you marry a woman from the Shiva Amamim who's not converted, her father, her parents are Ovdei Avodah Zarah. And you're going to have a child, and the child's going to go home to grandpa and learn about all idol worship. So we don't want you to marry them because we're worried, Torah is worried, that the child will end up becoming an idol worshiper.
What about a Gioret?
Bahani immediately says the Rabbi Giotam, but that only applies if they're still Goyim. But Ki Megayri Mishrashari. Even if the Shiva Amamim were converted, they would be permitted. Now, however, they're not. Rabbanan who degazru. The Rabbanan, it's only Midrabanan basically that one of the 7 Amamim converted is still Asur, either because we're worried that if you sleep with them when they converted, you'll sleep with them when they didn't convert, whatever, or there's other reasons. We're going to think more later that David goes there because they were cruel. I remember they killed the children of Shaul, the whole story that maybe you don't know the story, but we're going to learn the story soon, that the Givonim, said that Shaul's children had to die and they hung them. So anyways, that was a Rabbanan. It's not Midoraita. Midoraita, the problem is if they're still not Jewish. The Chigazu Rabbanan, now when Rabbanan goes there, it was only Hanach Be'oluti. It was only people who can have children. Ba'aval Hai, remember, the whole fundamental purpose or prohibition that they can't have children. And since they can't have children, since they're not capable of having children, the Chachamim did not make a Gzera. So therefore, the prohibition of a Netin doesn't tell you anything about a Kohen. It just tells you that Yisrael, who usually can't marry Shiva Amamim, can marry Shiva Amamim who converted if he's a Krut Shifcha, because since he's incapable of having children, they never made a Gzera. If that's true, then why can you should say a Mamzer couldn't marry them, right? Elamiyata Mamzer, remember a Mamzer can have children. There's nothing wrong with the person medically. So Debar Oludi, he can have children. Hachanami Dasir, you're saying that a Mamzer would not be allowed to marry a convert from the Shiva Amamim. That's not what the Mishnah says. We're going to have it soon. We're going to have it in Kedushin actually. Mamzerin unetinim mutarim lavoz abazah. That a Mamzer and a Netin are allowed to sleep with each other, and marry each other. So why is that the case? If you're telling me the whole reason is that it's because people can't have children, a Mamzer can easily obviously have children.
And their children are completely kosher?
No, children are mamzer, but they're allowed to sleep with each other. A mamzer can sleep with another mamzer, but the Mishnah in Kedushin says the mamzer can also marry an etin. Children are not kosher.
They keep the status of the parents?
Correct. Eliki gazur Rabbanan sherin. It's a little more complicated. The reason the Rabbanan were gozer is not because they could have children or not. It's they only were gozer, and Rashi makes it sound like it's in a common case, right, where people are kosher. In the less rare cases where they're psulim l'gazur abanan, of course, the other explanation might be that the mamzer needs to have someone to marry, right? So there is an interest. Rashi doesn't say this, but there is an interest in having some opportunities for them to marry and have children, and so you want to have people who they can marry. But Rashi says it's because it's not common. Actually, Rashi's both, right? Think about it. Rashi says, well, Rashi says something else, but he says the first one, which is that it's uncommon. Hadar Amar Rava. Now, Rava then thought about this a little bit more, and he said, you know what? I made a big mistake. Forget everything I just told you. Lav miltahi. What I just told you is not true, because it cannot be that when the Torah says lo titchanin bam, don't marry them, it's referring to don't marry them when they're non-Jews, because your children will then worship avodah zarah. You can't mean that, because how could the Torah say don't marry someone who's not Jewish? There's no concept of marriage, of chatnut, with a non-Jew, right? There's no, Torah can't say don't marry someone. You couldn't marry them. A Jew and a non-Jew who get married is not considered a marriage. So nitgairu only itlei chatnut, and clearly the Torah must be telling us, right, that lo titchanen bam, even if they convert, right? And the Torah is saying don't sleep with an etin even if they convert. However, a person, a Ben Yisrael, who's a Petzua Daka, is allowed to. And since a Ben Yisrael is a Petzua Daka is allowed to, a Kohen who's a Petzua Daka would also be allowed to sleep with a person like a Gioret who he wouldn't otherwise be able to marry.
And their children are also,
their children are Jewish. They're not.
They're kasher. I mean,
well, they're kasher, but they're not. A Gioret is kasher. Well, so first of all, Petzua Daka can't have children, right? So let's start with that.
Oh, okay.
I guess we'll stop with that too. Okay, so there is no children. If they have children, he's not a Petzua Daka. It might be a different problem, because if they have children, he's not a Petzua Daka, then he married a Giora when he wasn't supposed to. So.
Well, if he said Yisrael,
no, saying the cadence of a coin. Yisrael can marry Giora at any time.
Right.
Okay, Mativ Rav Yosef. Said Rav Yosef, what are you talking about? What do you mean that there's no concept of chatnut, of marriage between a Jew and a non-Jew? Don't you remember what happened with Shlomo? It says about Shlomo, we had this earlier in the Masechet, or similar. Vayitzchatein Shlomo et Bat Paro Melech Mitzrayim. Shlomo married the Bat Paro, the daughter of Paro, the king of Mitzrayim. So how could Shlomo, if you just tell me there's no concept of marriage between a Jew and a non-Jew, how could he say Shlomo married? Right. That's the Gemara, the obvious answer. What do you mean? She converted, of course, right? You're a Gaira. Of course she converted, right? That's where, what do you mean she converted? I thought we have a principle that there were no converts allowed in the days of Shlomo and David, because the Jews had it so good. We were worried that everybody was converting because they wanted to be part of the nation, not because they wanted to be part of Hashem's people. And hello, keep Lugerim, will be made David, will be made Shlomo. So how could you say she converted? You're not allowed to convert during those times. Well, no. The reason that we didn't accept converts, midi hutama. Remember, the only reason we didn't accept converts is al shulchan melachim, because we think they just want to, be at the table of the kings, meaning David and Shlomo had such great kingdoms that people wanted to come to bask in their glory. But Halo Tzichalei, this is the daughter of Paro, right? She's already a king or daughter of a king. She doesn't need to come to Bnei Yisrael to get this. So for her, you could convert. You can't convert if you're in a poor social status and you're coming to get the benefits. But if you already have benefits, there shouldn't be a problem. So therefore, says the Gemara, it must be that Shlomo married Bat Paro because she converted to Judaism. We just left out that detail in the story. The Gemara, well, so what if she converted to Judaism? She's a Mitzri. She's a first generation Mitzri, right? Let's say she converted. She's a generation. She's a Mitzri, was born a Mitzri, born Egyptian, and she's one generation in. She's the first generation. And she's not allowed to marry a Ben Yisrael. So how could Shlomo marry her, right? So Rashi says also, it's a little strange. Rashi says, and therefore, let's say Shlomo did marry her, she wouldn't be called chatnut because it's not a permitted marriage, right? Tosfos is very bothered. But anyways, that's what Rashi says. Says in there, well, maybe, remember that we have a very complicated discussion in our halacha about whether people today are really Egyptians or not, right? Or Ammoni or Moavi. Because there's a principle that the nations move, right? That nations are exiled and space out. And so says the Gemara, well, maybe, the people who were initially in Egypt went to the world. I mean, they dispersed. The people who live in Egypt now are other peoples, right? Remember, between the time of Yetziat Mitzrayim and the time of Shlomo was 400 years, right? So during that time, the people from Egypt dispersed, and they're not the same people. It's like, look in the United States today, right? Obviously, the people who are quote unquote American are not the same ones who were here 400 years ago.
Yeah, but you
So,
would think if it was Bat Paro, they probably, the lineage probably stayed,
okay, says the Gemara, and there again, there's a Tosfos here that talks a lot about these questions. If you recall, we've had a Gemara several times that after Sancheriv, we no longer talk about nations because Sancheriv came and was Bilbel HaUmot, and he mixed up the nations, right? But of course, remember that this is before Sancheriv, right? Long before Sancheriv. So David and Shlomo were a couple hundred years before Sancheriv, right? I don't know the exact years, but in our tradition, at least 200, maybe 250 years before Sancheriv. Says the Gemara, but that's not true about Mitzrayim. Because Hatanya, in fact, there's a Braita where Rabbi Yehuda said, Yehuda's a Tana, and he said, Min Yamin Ger Mitzri Haya, right? I had a friend, Hayali Chaver, right? I had a buddy whose name was Min Yamin, and he was a convert who was Egyptian. Again, Rabbi Yehuda lived, hundreds of years later after David and Shlomo, right? I had a friend who was a Egyptian convert, and he was Mitamidei Rabbi Akiva. He was one of the students of Rabbi Akiva. And Amar, he used to say, Ani Mitzri Rishon. I, Min Yamim, I'm a first generation, Mitzri Jew, Mitzri convert, right? First generation. Nasati Mitzrit Rishona, I'm going to marry, or I did marry, a first generation woman who converted from Egyptian woman. And then my son, or child, will be a second generation Mitzri convert. And Asad Libni Mitzrit Rishnia, I will have my son marry a second generation Mitzrit. We'll see later the question of does it really need to be a Mitzrit Shnia, or can he marry a Mitzrit Rishona, and who does it go after, the father or the mother? Then my grandson will be permitted to lavo bikal, because he'll be a third generation Mitzri. Remember the pasuk said, Dar Rishon and Sheni is pasuk, but Dar Shlishi and Revi'i is okay. So, but you see clearly that Mitzri stands in place. So even hundreds of years after Shlomo, Mitzri was still a thing. So how could Shlomo have married Bat Paro? Well, not a question of how can you marry her. The question is how could you call it a marriage, right? Because it's prohibited. Amarav Papa, 1 second. Anami Shlomo Leiko V'Nativ. You really are asking questions from Shlomo. Shlomo had his own issues. Shlomo lo nasiv nidi. Shlomo didn't marry her at all. Shlomo was just sleeping with people. He never married her. He didn't marry Bat Paro. He just had an affair with Bat Paro. How do we know that? Because it says about Shlomo, min hagoyim asher. This is when God's critiquing Shlomo, criticizing him. That's right, in Lachim. It says min hagoyim asher amar Hashem b'nei Yisrael lo tavo b'hem. Right, among the women, among the nations, where Hashem said, "Don't marry them." V'hem lo yavo b'chem, and they shouldn't marry you. Achein yatu et levavchem achrei aleichem, because they're gonna push your heart after their gods. Says the pasuk. Bahem davak Shlomo ahava. Shlomo attached himself to them for love. For love, says the Gemara, implies not for marriage. He was just sleeping with them. He loved them. Love is here differentiated from marriage, right? You would say he didn't want to marry them. He didn't want to have a long-term relationship with them. He loved them and he slept with them. So Shlomo's
clearly a marriage to cement an alliance.
The Gemara is doing what it can, right? Okay. So, but according to this opinion,
the Gemara just use that. It was a political marriage. It was
according to this opinion in the Gemara. The fact that it describes Shlomo's marriages as la'ahava is unusual, right? Who in the world would get married for love? It must be that Shlomo just fell in love with these people and wanted to sleep with them, but it wasn't like it seems in the pasuk to be an alliance and a relationship.
He had a lot of love to spread around.
A lot of love. Ella says more, but it does say the word v'yitchanin, kasha v'yitchanin. It says he married her, right? It says more. No. V'yitchanin, he did not marry her, but he loved her so much. Mitoch ahava yitera sha'aheva, because of how much he loved her and spent time with her and slept with her. It's as if he slept with her. And so this Gemara concludes, again, this is not the simplest sugya, as you know, but the bottom line is that Shlomo did not marry them, and you couldn't have, according to this opinion, chaninun, you couldn't have marriage to a non-Jew, but Shlomo was so enamored and in love with this woman, with Bat Paro, that we describe their affair as being like a marriage, but it's not a real marriage. Amrle Ravina Ravashi. Now Ravina said to Ravashi, well, I don't understand this whole Gemara. We learned in our Mishnah, Hanan Tznan, this is 1 year so. But Dako, Krot Shavcha, Mutarim Bigioret Ubishucheret. That a man who's a Petzua Daka is allowed to marry a convert. But it doesn't say you can marry a Nitina, right? It says only a convert, not a woman who is converted, who's from Shiva Amimim. Habenitina Asiri. So this goes against the right that we quoted earlier. Amar Leis, he said back to him, what do you mean? Look at the end of our Mishnah. Ema Seifa. It says, Inan Asrna Milavo Bikahal. A Petzua Daka is only prohibited to marry into the normal Kahal of Bnei Yisrael, implying that if a Nitina, who's not part of the Kahal, because they come from Shiva Amamim, would be a Sharu, would be permitted. You cannot derive a proof from our Mishnah. Our Mishnah is not clear as to what the status is of a Nitin to a Petzua Daka, but the Braita is very clear and says that it's totally permitted. Okay, so that's the end of that Mishnah. The next topic, and this is continuing the Psukim in Devarim, right? It says Petzua Daka, it says Mamzer, and then it says Mitzri V'Adomi, right? Says our Mishnah, then it's Amoni Moavi, and then Mitzri, sorry. Says the Mishnah, Amoni or Moavi, a woman who comes, or a man who comes from an Ammon or Moab, who's a convert, is a Surin. Not a woman, a man who's Ammoni or Moavi who converts, is asur to marry a Jewish woman, the Isuran Isur Olam, and the Isur is forever, meaning for all generations. So their children, their children's children, forever. Aval, mutarot miyad, but women who are born, either women who convert or daughters who are born, are mutar. So this only applies to men, male converts, and male heirs. Okay, that's by Ammoni and Moavi. Mitzri v'Adomi. Now the other two nations that are quoted, the Egyptians and the Adomim, are inan asurim elad shlosha darot. They're only prohibited up to the third generation, meaning generation 1 and 2. Generation 3 is permitted, and that is true. Echad zecharim v'echad nikevot. Both a female convert and a male convert and their children will be prohibited. So unlike the Ammoni and Moavi, where it's forever, but it's only men, Mitzri and Adomi is both genders, and it's only 2 generations. Rabbi Shimon says, I disagree. I don't think it applies to women. And says Rabbi Shimon, it's a kal v'chomer hadvarim. Ma'im b'makom she'asurat hatzcharim isur olam by Ammoni and Moavi, and where they asur males forever. So obviously it's a very strict chumrah of prohibition. Hatirat hanikevot miyad, but a female woman from Ammon and Moab is allowed to get married right away. So makom, that's the chamur, right? Makom shelo asarat hatzcharim, a place like Edom and Mitzri, where the males are only prohibited alad shlosha darot until the 3rd generation, which is much more kal. Isn't it likely that the nikevot are permitted right away? Amrulos, he said back to Rabbi Shimon, well, look, in halacha, if this is a halacha that you accepted, you have a tradition that Adomi and Mitzri are only men and not women, nikabel, we'll accept it. But in Ladin, if you're learning this from a kal v'chomer, yesh shuva, then we can answer that. The Gemara, of course, is going to ask what the tshuva is, but we have a way to refute that. So Shimon said back to them, "Lo ki halachani omer." No, I'm telling you, I have this as acceptance, a kabbalah that I got from my teachers, that this is the halacha, and I'm supporting it with the kal v'chomer, but it's not the kal v'chomer that's relying on me. I'm actually saying it based on the kabbalah halacha that I have.
What would be the status of a child born to Yisrael and a Mitzri? Assuming it's asur.
So the child would be a asur, be a Mitzri sheni.
Okay, not a mamzer, but a
no, not a mamzer. No, definitely not a Mitzri sheni. But again, the machloket is if it's a female child. But according to the Tanakama, and a 2nd generation, any child would be a Mitzri sheni, and that child could marry a Mitzri, a convert, Mitzri convert, like Newman said before. A Mitzri sheni, and their children will be permitted completely. Okay. Says the Menani Mili. What's the source for this question? That this very unusual thing that a Ammoni is lo Ammonit, right? That only a male Ammon, but not a female person, or Moaviv lo Moavit. Amr Yochanan Damar Kra. Now let's go. This is going to get to the crux of this question of what was David HaMelech, right? Because David HaMelech's great grandmother, Ruth HaMoaviyah, came from Moab, right? And so if a person from Moab is asur forever, then of course David would be prohibited lavo b'kahal. if it was true about men and women. So this is the pasuk. This is an early pasuk in Shmuel, right? Where they're, remember the whole story. They're fighting the Plishtim, and David comes up there and he says, "I can fight," right? And Damarkra, I'm Rabbi Yochanan Damarkra. Now we're quoting from Melachim. The pasuk says, "Ukirot Shaul et David." When Shaul saw David, Yotzei Likrat HaPlishti, going out to meet the Plishti, Amar el Avner Sar Tzava. He said to Avner, his general, right, his captain, Ben mi zeh hanar, Avner, who is this kid, right? Shocking to him. Who's this person who's a nar? David was a kid who's going out to fight the Plishtim, and he obviously to Shaul had a threatening, maybe as we know, very threatening visage, right? So he said, "Who is this person?" By Yomer Avner, and Avner said, "I have no idea. I swear to you, the king, I have no idea. I don't know who this kid is." Okay. Now it says, "Where is that true?" What do you mean he didn't know who he was? One parak before it, it says, right, about Shaul, that David came to Shaul, right? He loved him very much, and he became his whatever you call it. He carried his armor, right? He carried his Caleb. So David and Shaul have met each other already. So what do you, in the last parak in Shmuel, in parak Tet Zayin? So how could it be in parak Yud Zayin now that Shaul says to Avner, "Who is this kid?" Right? What's he talking about? Eli, he wasn't asking who is his kid. He was asking who is his father, right? He met David. He loved David, but now David is starting to get a little threatening, right? Because David is no longer just a helper to Shaul. Now he's going out to lead the battle, and all of a sudden Shaul says, "Wait a second. Where does this kid come from? What kind of threat is he?" Ahavua kam Mishael. He was asking not who is he, who is his father, what was his yichus? What do you mean, who is his father? Aviv lo yadai, never heard of his father? Haktiv, it says, and again, this is earlier in the parak, it says, Va'ish bimei Shaul zaken baba anashim. The man, meaning David's father, in the days of Shaul was a man who came among men. Baba anashim. What does baba anashim mean? Amar Rav Yitemar of Abba, that this is referring to Yishai Avi David. This man is referring to Yishai, the father of David, who was incredibly well known and well regarded. When he came in and he went home, he had hundreds of thousands of people. Literally means multitudes. Rashi says, 600,000. Either way, he was a tremendously powerful warlord who had thousands and thousands of people with him. So what do you mean Shaul didn't know who David's father was? Everyone knew David's father. Says, well, no. He was asking about his great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. Hachikamar Shaul. Shaul asked, Imi Peretz Ati, Imi Zerach Ati. We know that David came from the family of Yehuda, right? Remember that Yehuda and Tamar had two children, right? They had twins. They had Peretz and Zerach. And Shaul's question was, does he trace his lineage back to Peretz or to Zerach? Why do I care? Said Shaul in the Gemara now, Imi Peretz Ati, if he came from Peretz, then I'm very worried. Then Malka Havi. He's going to be a king, or he can threaten me to be a king. Because Shah Melech Poretz Laso Derech. Right? The king's, one of the cardinal features of a king is that the king has, power to take anyone's property. I forgot what the Latin term is, but there's some Latin term, right? That the way of the king is whatever it is, right? So the king can go anywhere they want. Peretz, remember, was the one who stuck his hand out first, right? And so that was a symbol. This is the king. This is the one who goes wherever they want to go. And so therefore, if he comes from Peretz, I'm worried that he's from the king side. You can't stop a king. Then whatever, he's just an important guy. He'll be some chashiv person, but he won't be king. So that was what Shaul was asking Doeg, right? He was asking Avner, sorry. Shaul was asking Avner, who is David? Who does he come from? Does he come from Peretz, in which case he might be king and therefore threaten me? Or does he come from Zerach? Last thing says the Gemara, but what's the context? Why all of a sudden is Shaul worried about where David comes from? My time, Amrle Sha'alale. Why in the world did Shaul say, I want to ask? It's because it said right before this, right, when David before David goes out to attack the Plishtim, it says, Vayalbesh Shaul at David Madav. Shaul gave David to wear his own clothing, his own armor, right? Now, the weird thing is that how could David fit his armor? It implies kimidato, that it fit him. And it says by Shaul, the very, very famous words by Shaul, that mishichmo umala gavo mikol ha'am, right? From his shoulders and up, he was taller, more royal, more prestigious than the whole nation, right? David is a little kid here. So somehow it seems that Shaul took his royal begadim, his royal armor, he put it on David, and it fit David perfectly. And Shaul started getting nervous. It fits him a little bit too perfectly. So now he's wearing my begadim. He's going out to meet the Plishti. All of a sudden, Shaul had the thought that would consume him for the rest of his life. Maybe David's going to take over from him, right? So then he said to Avner, "Who the heck is this kid?" And Avner said, "I have no idea. I don't know anything about his yichus. I don't know if he came from Peretz or Zerach." But Amrle, now the Gemara continues with our own narrative, our own midrash of what happened next. Amrle Doeg HaDomi, who was the chief rabbi in that day, right, according to the Gemara, said, before you ask Shaul if he's going to be a king, does he come from Peretz? Does he come from Zerach? Why don't you ask me if he's Jewish? Ask me if he can even marry a Jew, right? He comes from Moab. Forget about who his great-great-grandfather was, Yehuda. His great-grandmother was not Jewish, was from Moab. And so he asked me, can he even marry Bikahal? My time, Dikati mi Ruta Moaviyah. He comes from Ruta Moaviyah. So said Doeg, I don't know why you guys are all worried about whether he's a king. He's hardly Jewish. I'm really Avner said after 1 second. That's not right. Everyone knows the Braita. Tanina. We learned in a Braita. Again, I don't know what that means. Hundreds and hundreds of years before there were Braitot. But we learned in a tradition, Ammoni v'lo Ammonit, that the prohibition of marrying Ammon is only a man, not a woman. And Moavi v'lo Moavit. Said the Gemara, what are you talking about? I don't get it. Then when it says mamzer, it means not a woman. Ella, that's not a question. Mamzer means, we learned this before, mumzar. The person has a mum that they're a foreigner. So that's true about men and women because that's what it's related to. But it says, well, what about mitzri? You're going to apply mitzri below mitzrit, which again in our Mishnah was a machloket. It says, well, no. You don't understand. The reason for the limud of Ammoni below Ammonit and Moavi below Moavit is shani achad the mefarish time of the crop. The Torah gives a rationale for why this is a problem. What does the Torah say? Don't marry Ammon and Moab al asher lo kidmu etchem belechem b'mayim. Right? When you were coming out of Egypt and you were thirsty, they did not come to you and give you provisions. They didn't give you bread and water. So that's only a problem for men. You can hold the men guilty. They should have come out and greeted them. But the women are not expected to threaten themselves, to put themselves on the line to go out and greet them. And so therefore, it only applies to the men, not to the women. Says in, how do you know that's true? In the Medrash, right? This is Doeg answering back. Maybe the women should have gone out to greet the women. Maybe the men should have gone out to feed and to welcome the male to Bnei Yisrael, the Nashim Likrat Nashim, and Ishtik, everyone was quiet. So basically, they're sitting here at war, right? David is taking all the glory. Shaul's trying to figure out how big of a threat this guy is. He says, "Is he a king?" And then Doeg says, "Well, maybe he's not even Jewish. Well, not Jewish, but he can't marry a Jew." Avner says, "Well, we have a tradition that he can." And now they're going back and forth. No one has an answer. So Miyad, the next pasuk, which is a very interesting pasuk, is Vayomer HaMelech. The king said, after Avner said, "I don't know who he is," the king says, "Sha'al ata b'mizeh ha'elem." Ask who this Elem is. Elem literally means like a young person, right? A kid. But why did it change the word from nar to Elem? Right? Hatam kari le nar. In the first pasuk, it called him a child, or a nar. Hacha kari le Elem. Because Hachi kamerle. This is what Shaul was saying to his people. Hilch halacha nit'alma mimcha. You, Avner, have forgotten. Elam here means forget. You've forgotten the halacha. Say v'shal b'beit midrash. Go and consult with the rabbis. We have to resolve this issue. We need to know how big a threat David is. So Sha'al. So they went to the Beit Midrash and they asked and they said, "What's the status of Shaul, of David, who comes from Moavit?" Amulei, and they said in the Beit Midrash, everybody knows. Ammoni v'lo Ammonit, Moavi v'lo Moavit. So Doeg said, "Yeah, I heard that already today, but I have problems with that." Akshilu Doeg kohani kushyata. Doeg asked all the questions he asked, the ishtik, and they were quiet. So they had no resolution. So Ba'i la'achuz yaleh, the Doeg said, we have no way to resolve this. There's no answer for why it should apply to only a man and not a woman. And they wanted to go and announce the new rule. The new rule is that Moavit is pasul l'kahal and David is prohibited, which would have been very convenient for Shaul. But tomorrow you're going to find that it didn't quite work. So we will pick it up tomorrow about the next part of the story as to why exactly David was accepted ultimately, even though Doeg was about to announce that he's not accepted.
Yeah, but the problem is they had been accepting Moabite.
They had.
Moabiot. You know, you can't just go back and just say retroactively that all these people are Hasul once you've allowed people to come in.
You're correct.
So
Well, you could if you say they were making a mistake, but yes, it would be very challenging. We're going to see, obviously some of this is tongue in cheek, right? It's
I understand, but I mean,
I agree with you. So this is a medrash. We'll continue. I'm going to stop. I mean, I could keep going, but I feel like
I gotta go. Yeah.
Yeah, we all have to go. So, anyways, just it's top line, and I think I'll let Dov know if he doesn't hear us that that's where you'll pick it up tomorrow. Shavua tov.
Thank you.